Stuart Gray, MEPS Head of Research. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Speaking of Steel. It's great to have you in the studio.
And thanks again, Tom, for inviting me back.
No, pleasure. Lots to get through today, and I know you've got a lot of insight to share. What we're going to be doing is, as you're well aware, focus on the European automotive sector. It's a crucial time of the year for that sector because contract negotiations are starting, and we're also getting a picture perhaps where we're going to finish the year in terms of production, registrations and those things, which gives us a good view of the outlook. So first of all, I've previously spoken to Jato Dynamics global automotive analyst Felip Munoz and also Professor David Bailey, who's a professor of business economics at the University of Birmingham Business School. I got my mouth around that. So I'll just listen to that interview first, and then we'll discuss the steel market and those all-important contract negotiations straight after. Here's the interview.
So I'll introduce you both. Felip Munoz from Jato Dynamics, Professor David Bailey from the University of Birmingham Business School. Great to have you both on the Speaking of Steel podcast for a real sort of deep dive into Europe's automotive sector. I know you're both from previous roles myself, so it's great to have your insight here today. Thanks for joining me both.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.
Great stuff. I mean, at MEPS, we're very used to clearly covering aspects of the steel industry, but with automotive being one of the prime consumers of steel, our fates are tied very close together. I just wondered, I guess, first of all, from you, Felipe, we hear that European car production is expected to end 2025 with a further reduction in output. Can you sort of perhaps summarize a few of the main challenges that the industry faces at the moment?
Well, that's a challenging thing to summarize all the problems that the European industry has right now. It's true, it's not living its best times because in addition to demand issues in Europe, well, now the car makers operating in Europe are facing new threats from outside. The Chinese car makers are coming to Europe, many of them with very, very ambitious plans. Then in addition to that, well, you have the tariffs issue that it's somehow solved, let's say. But the problem, it's also structural. So, I mean, there are issues behind the industry that they need to be addressed in terms of competitivity, in terms of costs. All of these things are playing against the European car industry, particularly now that it is not only competing against Japan or the US or Korea, as it has been the case over the last 50 years, but now it's China changing the game. So I would say those elements are the ones reshaping the European car industry right now.
I think you've recently produced some of your data on registrations. How significant is that Chinese influence now?
Well, look, there is a lot of noise around it because obviously these car makers are growing very fast, the Chinese car makers. But when you look at the figures, well, in the best of the cases, August 2025, they got a 5% market share in Europe, right, including the UK. So, well, 5% is nothing big, is just something marginal. But the key issue to understand here is the speed at which they are growing. Because a year earlier, their market share was half of that. So it's very hard to find other cases in the industry where you see such growth rates in the industry. So so far, when you look at the picture right now, I mean, of course, they are still marginal players. There is a big awareness issue and in some cases reputation issues as well. But they are coming up with very competitive products, especially in a time when most of the cars that you find out there, new cars, are very expensive. So the Chinese are becoming like this alternative choice, or the only choice for many people who cannot simply afford the prices nowadays.
Okay, okay. I thought we'd get very quickly to Chinese, the Chinese influence. But David, I'll come to you, and I guess what I'm interested to understand a little bit of is to what extent perhaps the EU, Europe has played into that rhetoric about rising Chinese EV production with its own decarbonisation targets. Has that been a factor in its downturn, really?
So, yes and no. I mean, I think Europe, the European Union and the UK have set targets in terms of decarbonisation for good reasons. That's to get to net zero by 2050. So if we are going to decarbonise, transport needs to be part of that. The problem is, for the European industry, that who makes the cheapest EVs in the world and who have been at it for 25 years is China, and increasingly they're making very good EVs, as Felipe was saying, which European industry simply can't compete with. So China's been at this for a long time. They have a cost advantage of 30 to 40%. The European industry faces really, I think, in the mass market, an existential threat because of that, unless it can innovate quickly, get costs down, produce really good products. And I was reading recently the Draghi report on European competitiveness, and he spoke specifically about the European industry in terms of high energy costs, high labour costs. But not only that, there's this need to innovate as well. So essentially, China's been at this for a long time. They set a vision at the turn of this century to go electric. They made batteries. They've had an industrial strategy that has put in hundreds of billions of euros into making this happen. And they're way ahead of Europe. So Europe's got to catch up and catch up quickly. So the tariffs are simply about trying to buy time to allow Europe to adjust. If it doesn't, I think the mass industry may well go.
Well, you've read the Draghi report, and I'm sure you're studying it on a daily basis, David. But how much of a shortfall is European production facing now? I guess given the lack of consumer demand as well at the moment, and how straightforward will it be to turn this around?
I think it's going to be extremely challenging given the lead that China has, and I think part of what Europe has done as well in terms of trying to build a domestic battery supply chain has kind of backfired. We saw that with the collapse of Northvolt, which there was, I think, $15 billion worth of investment attracted to the firm, and it collapsed. It simply could not compete with Asian battery manufacturers. So instead of trying to recreate the wheel, I think what the EU's got to do is say to Chinese battery makers and car makers and those from Korea, come to the EU, set up production here for the European market, and then look to form joint ventures with them and to learn from them to boost the competitiveness of the industry. This kind of fortress Europe approach, I think, risks backfiring and not allowing Europe to actually catch up.
Okay. So in some senses, competitiveness or collaboration rather would be preferable, wouldn't it?
Yes, very much so. And I think that's what China did for a long time, wasn't it? They allowed foreign investment in, but with joint ventures with the local firms, they had a process of learning, research and development, and over time they improved the competitiveness of the industry. I think what we've got to realise is that it's Europe that is now catching up, not China.
Absolutely. David, you mentioned the tariffs. I guess, Felipe, in looking at the registration figures, we'll have a very clear picture of the effect those tariffs might have had. Felipe, what effect have they had in the EU in terms of mitigating that Chinese influence? And I guess in comparison with the UK, where there still aren't tariffs on Chinese EVs, what's the difference we're seeing in numbers?
Well, I think the tariffs, personally, I think it's just a short-term solution, just to give the legacy car makers some time. Mm-hmm. but it doesn't solve the real problem, which is the lack of competitivity of the European car industry. That's a different story. So the tariffs, yes, obviously have somehow affected the growth rate that the electric Chinese cars were posting over the last year. But still, when you look at the figures, well, they are the registrations of pure electric cars coming from the Chinese brands is growing up by 41% through August. So even though that's not as much as the growth rates that we saw last year, their cars are so competitive, and they are really making a lot of efforts to increase the awareness, to increase the presence through dealers and after sales service, that people are still considering these cars despite the increasing prices. The interesting thing that we've seen since the imposition of these tariffs is how fast these car makers from China are responding to it. Because one way they are doing it is by introducing other powertrains. We must remember China is not only good at making pure electric cars, but also plug-in hybrids, or lately full hybrids, what they call the new energy vehicles in China. So these cars are the ones that are offsetting the let's say the minor growth posted by the electric cars. And when you look at this, the Chinese are making a lot of progress, especially in the plug-in hybrids. Between January and August, their volumes increased by more than 600%, and many of their cars are already in the top 10 in the European ranking. So this is one way they are doing it, but it's not only, as I said, MG, for example, is betting a lot on the hybrids, just as Toyota has done over the last 25 years. So the tariffs did have an impact, but at the end of the day, they have other things to offer, and unlike the Europeans, they move fast and adapt fast to the new market conditions.
Absolutely, and I guess the fact is that, as David mentioned, that the profit margins already at these Chinese manufacturers seem to be so large that they're able to discount their vehicles to mitigate the effect of any tariffs. Is that right, David?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, sorry, Felip, were you going to come in, or?
No, after you, no problem.
No, okay, thanks. So, I mean, in China, in several market segments, electric cars are actually cheaper than internal combustion engine cars. Now, within China, there's a massive price war going on. There are over 100 EV makers. Many of those will go bust, and a handful will emerge. Companies like BYD are relatively well positioned, but enormous price war, which is catching out the likes of Tesla. So cars there are so cheap, they can export them to Europe, pay a tariff of 35-45% in total, and still sell it and compete with the Europeans. Then on top of that, as Felipe was saying, they're then thinking, well, okay, if there's tariffs, well, if we do a hybrid, that isn't subject to the tariff, so they can get around that way. And also, Chinese firms are increasingly looking at producing in, say, Vietnam or Thailand, and then exporting from there into the EU. So tariffs are just a kind of a temporary sticking plaster to try and buy a little bit of time, but Chinese firms will find a way around that, and the European firms really need to speed up quickly.
Felipe, sorry, if you wanted to come in on that tariff point as well. Oh, you've got your sound off.
Sorry.
It's
yes,
okay.
One element that David just clearly explained is the price war in China, because not everything is perfect for these Chinese car makers. Their current objective is to expand globally, no matter how much money they make, because that's one of the, let's say, advantages of being protected by the Chinese government, in the way that many of them are not worried about making profits, because there is the Chinese central government helping them with whatever they want. And so when you compete against this mentality, this way of making business, it's very hard, because in this side of the world, if you don't make money, you just close, right? In China, well, even though we've seen many brands disappearing because of financial problems, when you look at the operating margin of many of these Chinese makers, they're not as strong as the Western ones. Even though the Western car makers are posting big drops in terms of profitability, in many cases, their profits are even higher, or their margins are still higher than the Chinese. So this is something that we need to understand, because the competition is not only about the product, but it's also about this way of understanding capitalism, let's say, right? If profitability is not the priority, then of course you're going to disrupt the market with massive volumes everywhere.
Absolutely. And David, is it possible to compete, in any other scenario than partnership? Is that the only outcome?
I think it's one of the outcomes. So that would be involved, designing cars together, being able to speed up the design process. Because as Felipe was saying earlier, the Chinese manufacturers, the development time has been slashed dramatically. So whereas a European car maker would be looking at 3-4 years, the Chinese players have got it down to less than 2 years. So they're constantly bringing new cars to market, and which are improving. And that's been a major problem for Western companies. Think about Tesla at the moment. Partly it's losing market share because of the toxicity of some of Musk's comments, but also because its model lineup is so old now, whereas Chinese players can accelerate that. And so I think collaboration between European firms and Chinese firms will be really important in that sense. But there are other things as well. We need a much clever industrial strategy in Europe to back car makers, I think, to help them get costs down. Energy costs are a massive issue in Europe post-Ukraine war. That's a major factor. So I think there are things that need to be done to get costs down, support innovation, and also collaborate with the best companies around the world, wherever they are. And I think it's important not to be over-dependent on China, but for example, in terms of building a supply chain for batteries, that's got to be diversified. But, this idea of Europe going it alone, putting up barriers, I don't think that's going to work.
Do we think that, will Europe's car production output decline over time and perhaps focus on a more premium sector? Or do we think, those numbers will come back that we saw pre-COVID? I'm sorry, I'll
sorry, yeah.
David at the moment.
Of course, that's exactly what's happened in the UK over many years. It's increasingly it's a premium and luxury production base. There's a question of whether that will happen in Europe. If Europe can attract, Chinese investment into Europe, there's a chance that mass production could be maintained, but with different ownership. Otherwise, I think Europe can compete in the premium market. But even there, Chinese products are emerging at the high end, which, are going to compete with Mercedes and BMW. So even that isn't secure in the long term.
Absolutely. Is that what you're seeing, Felipe? People are choosing premium Chinese as well?
Well, but before that, I just was going to add that the European market has already lost around 3 million units per year before the pandemic, and between the pandemic and today. So that is already happening even before the Chinese came. This is it's not a trend that started with the Chinese. The European car market is mature, is old. The population doesn't grow anymore. So many other things are affecting already the car sales in Europe. And the fact that this is happening is becoming a major issue, because the production in Europe needs to be repositioned. Those volume cars are not possible to produce anymore in Western Europe. It's very expensive. And the best example is that most of the small cars that Europeans drive nowadays are not built in Europe anymore. The recent Renault Clio presented in Munich last week is going to be made in Turkey. It's not going to be made in France. The recent Fiat Grande Panda is made in Serbia. And Morocco is also playing its part. So it's already happening. But what Europe needs to do is how to deal with these Chinese. One way is to go against them through tariffs, which is, in my opinion, wrong, because I agree with David. For me, the only solution is collaboration. Just as the Western did with the Chinese for 30 years in China, now it's the opposite way. Now the Western car makers need the know-how from the Chinese in order to meet these goals, because it's not them who want to become electric. It's the European Commission, the regulation is forcing them to move, to change into something that they haven't done for since they were created 120 years ago. And it happens that the Chinese are the ones who know how to do it in a proper way, in a competitive way. So collaboration is the only way forward. Yeah.
One of the things that we've not really touched on, but mentioned early on, the decarbonisation priorities in Europe. We've seen a lot of European car manufacturers. In fact, I interviewed one for MEPS a while back, someone from Stellantis, about circular economy and recycling and the change in the makeup of materials that are used to make cars. From a MEPS point of view, we're very interested in this because it's very steel focused. But David, I'll ask you primarily. Do we foresee that there will be less steel in cars or more recycled steel as time goes on? Is this part of the efficiency and the priority set that we've got in Europe?
Yes, it is. We see it also in terms of batteries. So we're going to need a circular economy when it comes to batteries to reduce reliance on battery supply chains globally, but also in terms of steel. And also that reflects a shift, within the steel industry towards more electric arc furnaces, which will be fed with scrap. Now, whether they can produce the high quality steel that is needed in the car industry, I think is going to be the challenge going forwards, but that is improving. But essentially, yes, much more in the way of recycling going forwards, and that coming back into recycled steel. But also the use of other materials as well. So, aluminium increasingly being used to get weight down. I've got a very old Tesla car. That's an aluminium car. Increasingly use of aluminium, particularly in the premium end of things, to get weight down. But also other materials as well coming out of aerospace. So longer term, yes, less steel and more high quality steel, but also more recycled steel.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Just before we sign off, because I'm conscious that we've probably got to about the time limit I was hoping to set for the chat. David, I gather you've been very much involved in scrutinising the effects of a recent cyber attack on Jaguar Land Rover, and I can't help but think that that's really flagged up something of a wild card, really, in vehicle production, and certainly it's going to affect supply chains in the UK. Can you just summarise what's happening there and what the situation is at the moment?
Yes, I think it's a wake-up call for the auto industry in general, and I do think auto firms are vulnerable to this sort of attack, given that they are massive organisations with big supply chains and they are linked and connected. So cyber attack, which essentially crippled Jaguar Land Rover at the back end of last month, production has been shut down all of September so far, isn't set to restart until the 1st of October at the very earliest, but I think it may be longer than that, and a phased restart. That has affected the supply chain here in the UK, but also in places like Slovakia, where JLR have a plant at Nitra. JLR itself, I think, will get through this, although it's going to take a very big cash hit. I think the hit to revenue by the end of this month will be something like 2.2 billion. But I've got real fears about the state of the supply chain in the UK, given many of the smaller companies, as you come down the supply chain, simply don't have the cash buffers in place to withstand this. And the UK is different to, say, Germany, where there's a part-time wage subsidy scheme, whereas if there's a shock that impacts on an industry, workers are put onto part-time working, the government tops up the wages, they're retrained, they're ready to go. UK doesn't have that. So there's a call for some sort of emergency support, as we saw in the wake of MG Rover collapsing, to keep the supply chain in place so that Jaguar Land Rover can restart production down the line. There's a knock-on effect because some of these suppliers also supply the likes of Toyota Mini. So there's a fear in the wider industry that if bits of the supply chain go under, they're also going to be affected. So, some really big issues that have come out of this. And, I think it's a wake-up call for business in general to take cybersecurity more seriously.
Yeah, it comes at a time when, as we said before, the supply chain is in quite a fragile state anyway, isn't it, with weak demand? So worrying times. We'll leave it there. Felipe, David, thanks ever so much for joining me for this quick chat. It's been really insightful, and will certainly give Speaking of Steel listeners a good strong overview of the challenges facing the automotive market at the moment. Thanks ever so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gents.
Bye-bye.
Lovely, great stuff. Stuart, insightful interview, I think, covered a lot of bases and gave a lot of context for the conversations about steel procurement prices that we're about to have. As we introduced before, negotiations are probably just about getting underway between steelmakers and European OEMs in the automotive sector. And those price discussions will be panning out over the coming weeks and months. In terms of that negotiation process, what are MEPS's expectations of how that might pan out this year?
Yeah, I think if you look at the market, I think there's no secret that the market demand is still very weak. And with that in mind, before I answer that question, I just want to take a step back and really support what both Felip and Professor David Bailey actually stated. And it was very, very insightful, I must say. But just a quick snapshot, or just to reinforce what they've said. In August, and I'm just taking Germany's production, in August it was really down. It was more than 20% down on the production figures. Exports were also down, but that was to be expected because of the holiday shutdown. If you just compare the year-to-date figures, you could say it's stable to up, maybe marginally up by about 2%. So from our research, we see that the service centers, at least, that supply into the OEMs, that demand is stable. Forecasts look good for October and November in terms of volumes. The big question, however, that's coming out loud and clear is what happens in December. So we'll have a scenario where what they're thinking is that probably OEMs will shut down earlier than usually during that time period, and that will affect the whole supply chain. So there's a bit of a question mark in December. But all in all, the automotive demand is holding up. But also bear in mind that compared to pre-COVID figures, it is very much down by about 11% approximately, give or take. And then also on top of that, you've got the threat of the Chinese vehicle imports, which is still coming in unabated, as we heard in the recording. So that's something else to take account of. And then on top of the automotive, you've also got the industrial demand, which is low. So overall, perhaps a stable to weaker type of market. And that will obviously influence the negotiations going forward.
On each year, we see a crucial event at this time in the calendar. This year, it's Black Expo, which will sort of coincide with these contract negotiations and probably is a bit of a catalyst for early agreements. What are your expectations about how they will go? I guess, as ever, when these things start, the tensions are quite high to see what the outcome might be.
Yeah. I attended Black Expo 2 years ago. Myself and a colleague, Adam Crooks, we're going to be attending later this month. And we're both quite excited to see what will transpire. But essentially what happens there is that there's a feeling out, as it were, between the steel producers and the prospective service centres to start negotiations for either annual contracts or shorter time frame contracts. And it's always interesting to see these dynamics out in play. The OEMs are obviously pushing the service centres to get that price at a lower level. So the OEMs are pushing for a reduction in price against the current annual contracts, and the steel mills are obviously pushing for the increase. And we saw that in July. Obviously, the price in their mind is unsustainably low, and they can't carry on because of the higher input cost as well as the higher energy costs. So they'll be pushing for that increase, and further down the supply chain, they will be wanting a decrease. Our expectations probably will be a conclusive, possibly stable outcome, maybe marginally up, but it's always exciting at these times. We saw last year it was pushed right over past December into January. This year could be slightly different, although I think it's still going to be a very tough time for all players around the negotiation table. Yeah, we will see if it does leapfrog from December into January.
Speaking to MEPS research partners, as you do to gather this market information, how wide apart are the expectations at the moment of OEMs and the steel makers? Because, you know, with the market, the spot market certainly being at a low ebb, it's quite interesting to see how their expectations align.
I think it's important to have a look at where the prices now and where it's come from. So if you look back in January, MEPS price, base price indication was at 560 euros a ton. It did creep up quite fast, I must add. By May, we were looking at 630 at that stage. And that was due to the tariffs and what was happening with the reciprocal tariffs and all the geopolitical tension, so forth. And then it suddenly dropped, and it bottomed out in July at 550. That's when the steel mills came in and started to push the prices up. And there was a series of mill price increase announcements pushing up by 50 euros. At this moment in time, we're sitting at 560, but we're expecting from our forecast, and it has been downgraded of late, but we're expecting probably by December an extra 30 on that. So what does that mean for the negotiations? Bearing in mind that we also expect prices to increase in the first quarter leading into the second quarter. So we expect that if you look at the steel mills, they're obviously looking for higher than probably that 50 mark. We have heard of higher figures. And if you look at OEMs, they will naturally be way below that. They'll be looking probably for 30 to 50 reduction. So it will be interesting to see if they agree on either reduction or plus. Our sense is that probably it might remain stable.
Yeah, it's a challenging time, and as the interview said, you know, with there are cutbacks and efforts to reduce expenditure in European OEMs right now. So you can only imagine the stakes are very high. Clearly, I'm interested to explore the outlook as well for the sector and its pricing structure, really, because there are a lot of things that might affect that in the coming months. Can you give me a little taste, I guess, of how steel prices and various market forces might influence the automotive supply chain?
Yeah, I think looking at various trade measures, that has definitely, this is whether you're looking at quotas or you're looking at reciprocal tariffs, all these type of embargoes, that will definitely have an effect of a reduced risk on price falls. But you've got the added implication of CBAM. Now, at this stage, it's still very uncertain what that rate per ton will be, whether we're looking at EAF or imports from EAF producers or from blast furnace, but it's going to have an effect, and it's going to have that increase effect. Our expectations is that once that is made known, then domestic mills might look at that and increase accordingly, depending what their strategy is against CBAM. It may not be fully implemented, although it might. So I think either which way you look at it, there will be an increase effect on that. But I think also it's important to note that imports have become less of an option for most steel buyers, especially with the caps back in April into the EU. But possible headwinds is a weak auto demand, high inventory levels, and of course the cost pressures that everybody's feeling at the moment.
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it, in that earlier interview, just to hear about the pressure from imports from China in the finished product, just as we see in steel sector as well, and we've seen those various anti-dumping measures and things like that to tackle Chinese overcapacity.
If I could just add one thing,
of course,
think it was Felip that mentioned it, that perhaps maybe a collaborative way forward could be the better option for Europe, not only in automotive but other industries, as opposed to try and push back.
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, that's the real concern, isn't it? The sustainability of industry, the sustainability of that demand, and prices are going to adjust accordingly.
Absolutely.
Stuart, thanks ever so much for joining me for that automotive podcast. Great insight from you. Really enjoyed the chat, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks a lot.